Today we are going to be reflecting on the year of 2024 with my 2024 reading spreadsheet. Not my reading spreadsheet, my reading stats. Although some of these stats have come from my reading spreadsheet, so I think that's where I was going with that intro. But basically this is the video I like to make at the end of the year where I reflect on how my reading has gone the previous year. I actually usually do a mid-year update. However, last year when it got to the summer, I didn't feel like I really had that much to say. And that's something that I've noticed over the past few years is I felt like these videos have started to feel a bit samey, and I never want to feel like I'm just making a video for the sake of it. So for this video I've taken some reading stats from various sources. So I have my reading spreadsheet, which was created by G at Book Roast for anyone who is interested. I always have it linked in the description. Alongside my reading spreadsheet I also have my Goodreads, and then I've also taken some stats from YouTube because I thought it might be also interesting to look at what my most popular videos were this year. So we are gonna kick things off with my overall totals. So in 2024 I read 46,000 pages across 119 books. That's according to my reading spreadsheet, and it does also include audiobook hours. I listened to 462 hours of audiobooks, which sounds like a lot, but I never listen to audiobooks on one-time speed, and that's the only way I can record it accurately. So usually I listen on around 1.75-ish times speed, and then I adjust it if it's too fast or too slow. But if I was listening to those audiobooks on one-time speed, then I would have listened to 462 hours. One of my main goals for 2024 was to reduce my owned TBR, and I managed to reduce it by 28 books in the end, which is better than zero. I am hoping to improve on that this year, but I listened to 41 audiobooks last year, so that leaves 78 books that I read either physically or on my Kindle. If my maths is correct, then there were only 16 books that I read physically that weren't books that I owned. So those were books that I probably borrowed from my partner or that I borrowed from the library. When it comes to audiobooks, I do use my library, but I mostly use subscription services. So I used Scribd at the start of the year, and then I switched to BookBeat a few months ago. February was my worst reading month in terms of the number of books that I finished. Not really surprising considering I had a terrible start to the year, and so by the time I got to February, I think it was just a knock-on effect from that. I also went to New York in February and I got sick right before I went to New York, so I was stressed, I was dehydrated, and I wasn't having a good time. So that's probably why February was my worst reading month. Generally, I feel like I am pretty consistent though throughout the year. Even if you look at my breakdown in terms of pages, sometimes I will start a book towards the end of a month, and then those pages will end up being counted in the following month. So this isn't really that accurate, and I feel like I need to find a better way of actually tracking this. Over 90% of the books I read were adult, and then the rest were YA or new adult. 50% of the books I read were standalones, and the rest were part of series or companion novels, which is great because one of my goals last year was to make sure I was prioritizing series. I finished 10 series in 2024, which was another goal for the year, so very happy with that. My average star rating this year was a 4.0, which is obviously fantastic. I feel like over the past few years I've gotten better and better at working out what my taste actually is. I do a lot of research before I decide to commit to reading a book, so usually I have a pretty good idea of whether I'm going to like it or not just based on reviews. I rated 31 books 5 stars, 45 books 4 stars. I had 8 2-star reads and 1 1-star read, which if you missed my most disappointing books of the year video, then I'll leave that linked in the cards and in the description. Of those 8 books that I rated 2 stars, 3 of them were fairy romantasy books, which is why I ended up cancelling my subscription. I was going to make a video all about that, but I decided not to because I didn't feel like I really had much to say other than a lot of the recent romantasy releases just haven't been working for me, and I feel like they haven't been prioritising what I want in a fantasy romance. What I also find interesting is of the books I rated 5 stars, only 2 of them were 2024 releases. Even if I was to include the 4.5 stars, only 5 were new releases published in 2024. None of my favourite books of the year were 2024 releases, whereas if you look at my 2 stars and below, 7 of them were 2024 releases out of 9, which is actually kind of shocking if you think about it. I really struggled with 2024 releases last year. Hopefully 2025 will be better because I do like to pay attention to new releases. Maybe I was just unlucky with the ones I was picking up last year. The average length of the books that I was reading was 400 408 pages, which I think is about average. Most of the books I read were between 300 and 450 pages. There were 16 books I read that were over 500 pages, and the longest book I read was A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones was the shortest book I read at 136 pages. Moving on to my genre breakdown, I read 34 fantasy books, which is the biggest piece of the pie, followed by mystery or thriller. I read 29 mysteries and thrillers in 2024. Romance and fantasy romance would be the next biggest piece of the pie, but then the rest is a good mix of sci-fi, horror, lit fic, and historical. I always love it when this particular graph looks really colourful because it shows that I am reading across all of the genres that I love. Most of the books I read were published in the last 5 years. The oldest book I read was Passing by Nella Larson, which was published in 1929. In terms of my author stats, around 70% of the books I read were written by white authors, 25% were written by authors of colour, 74% were written by women, and 21% were written by men. 3 books were written by non-binary authors, and 3 were written by multiple authors. Most of the books I read were written by authors I've read from before. I only read 12 books by debut authors, but I feel like this is actually often quite low. I'm getting deja vu. I feel like I've said this in pretty much every stats video from the past few years. I don't know why, I just don't tend to read many books by debut authors. 67% of the books I read were written by American authors and 16% were British. The rest is quite a broad mix. I would like for this to be more diverse. I feel like I say this every year, and I do try and read a few translated books each year, but this year I only read 2, which probably didn't help. One of my most read authors last year was Frida McFadden, and I don't know how to feel about this because even though I read 6 of her books, I wouldn't say that she's a favourite author. I only tend to recommend her books if you're specifically looking for a popcorn thriller. If you watched my most disappointing books of the year, you all know that the one-star rating I gave this year was to a Frida McFadden book. However, I keep picking up the audiobooks for her books because I find them really addictive. I tend to listen to them when I need motivation to go to the gym or to go for a run. I get really caught up in her stories and it motivates me. My next, or my equal most read author, was Mike Omer, who wrote 2 series that I read this year, the Zoe Bentley series and the Abby Mullen series. Both of those I did really enjoy and would recommend if you like dark crime thrillers. The most popular book I read, according to Goodreads, was Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, which has been shelved by almost 4 million people on Goodreads. That is a lot of people. In comparison, my least popular book, or the least popular book that I read, was Leave No Trace by Jo Callahan, possibly because this is a British thriller, so it hasn't been published elsewhere, maybe, or at least it's not had much traction elsewhere. I did enjoy this series. It's the second book in a crime detective series. It has a lot of commentary on AI, and it's also set in Warwickshire, which isn't that far from me. The final thing that I wanted to look at is some channel stats. So I'm not going to talk about subscriber numbers, but I thought it would be quite interesting to look at my top performing videos of the past year, just in case anyone is interested. I always find it interesting to look at this sort of stuff. What I did find interesting last year is that 6 of my top 10 best performing videos were videos that I published that year. 4 were videos that I published many years ago. I actually made a video back in 2021 when I read Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson for the first time, and it's still one of my top performing videos every month. It tends to get a lot of search traffic from people looking for Brandon Sanderson videos on YouTube, which I find very interesting. The same with Riley Sager actually. There was a video that I made ranking his books back in 2022, around the time that House Across the Lake came out. That video is clearly out of date now because he's released 3 books since then, but people still seem to enjoy watching it and it still gets a lot of traffic. My Round with the Outlandings guide just about made it into the top 10, but that video is pretty much evergreen unless Robin Hobb decides to publish more books in that series. Then that video can just sit on my channel for anyone at any point who is interested in learning more about that series, and that is something that I want to continue to think about in 2025. I want to make content that first of all I enjoy making and that people enjoy watching, but I also want to think about the longevity of the content and whether people are still going to be interested in it in a year or two's time. I think a lot of the vlogs that I've been making, they've been getting views when they first go live, but then people are just not interested in them once the time has passed. And so yeah, that is something that I'm going to be bearing in mind throughout 2025. And I think that's a good place to leave this video. So thank you for watching if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments how your reading stats compare to mine if you have been tracking your reading this past year. There might have been a few occasions where I've said this year when I actually mean 2024. I am still on 2024 time. It was my first week back at work this week and my brain is still struggling to get my head around it. But yeah, let me know in the comments how your reading went last year, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me. But otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye.